They say a pack is only as strong as the alpha who rules it, but its soul always belongs to the one they call weak. Watch the gates of the Great Lodge groan open into a wall of screaming white. Watch a barefoot woman in a torn linen dress step out into a cold that kills, her head held high, no tears on her face. Behind her, the heavy doors slam shut like the tolling of a bell for the dead. She does not look back at the man who condemned her. She looks up to a high window where 3 small faces press against the freezing glass, and 3 small hands rise to answer hers. She was cast out to die, stripped of everything, believed by no one. But the soft little thing they all threw away into the snow was about to become something none of them had a name for. In the great timber lodge of the Black Pine, where the rafters rose like the ribs of some sleeping beast and the hearth fire never died, there was a woman who held every fragile thing together with her bare hands. Her name was Rowan. She did not roar. She did not bare her teeth at the council table. She did not need to. When 2 young warriors came in from the eastern ridge with blood on their knuckles and murder in their eyes, it was Rowan who stepped between them. One soft word, one hand on each heaving chest, and the fight drained out of them like water through open fingers. That was her power, though few in the lodge ever called it that. This evening, the snow came down slow and patient beyond the tall windows, and Rowan knelt on the worn floorboards near the fire, a needle held steady between 2 fingers. A man sat before her, jaw clenched, a long gash torn down his forearm from a border skirmish. She worked the thread through his skin with a gentleness that made the big warrior look away, ashamed of how his eyes stung. The scent of her filled the warm room, lavender and rain, and something underneath it that no one could ever name. Something that made a frightened heart slow down. Something that made a grown wolf feel for one breathless moment like a boy again, safe in a place where nothing could reach him. "Almost done," she murmured. "You did the hard part already." She tied off the thread, pressed her palm flat over the wound, and the warrior breathed out, long and shaking, as the ache eased beneath her touch. Behind her, a small body collided into her back. "Rowan, Rowan, he won't stop." The voice belonged to Finn, 7 years old, all knees and elbows and wild dark hair, his small hands fisted in the back of her wool dress. Behind him stood his brothers, Cole, the eldest at 10, golden-eyed and watchful, already carrying himself with the quiet weight of a future leader, and Wyatt, 9, heavily built for his age, fierce as a struck flint, his small claws sliding out and in, the way they always did when his blood ran too hot to hold. These 3 were not born of her body. Their mother had died long ago, in a winter Rowan still could not speak of. But in every way that ever mattered, they were hers. She had walked the floor with them through fever. She had sung the predatory hunger out of their small chests when the moon pulled at instincts too large for their little bodies to carry. She had taught them, again and again, the difference between leadership and tyranny. "Wyatt," she said, not turning around. "Come here." The boy hesitated in the doorway, breathing hard. His eyes flashed gold, then faded. "Come here, sweet boy." He came. She gathered him into her lap as if he weighed nothing, this 9-year-old who would one day be a monster of muscle and fang, and she pressed her lips to his hair and simply held him until the claws slid back in and stayed. "There," she whispered. "There you are. There's my Wyatt." Cole watched from the doorway, and something in his young face softened that he would never have shown his father. Rowan looked up at all three of them then, and she lifted one hand, tapped her own chest, twice, then pointed, slowly, toward the dark line of the forest beyond the window. The boys grinned, all three of them. It was their secret, their oldest, most sacred game. Be brave, it meant. Wherever you are, whatever comes, be brave, and I will always find you. They tapped their own small chests back, and for one golden moment in the firelight, in the falling snow, the whole world was warm, but not every eye in that lodge was kind. From the shadowed gallery above the hall, a woman watched the tender scene below with a stillness that had nothing of warmth in it. Sloane, a beta of high blood and colder ambition, beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful, all clean lines and a promise of harm. She had stood in the wings of this pack for years, watching a soft little Omega hold the hearts of the fiercest warriors in the territory, and she had hated every quiet hour of it. Strength should rule, Sloane believed, not softness, not lullabies and stitched wounds and secret little games by the fire. Her fingers tightened on the cold iron rail. Soon, she thought, and somewhere in the dark folds of her gown, against her ribs, a sealed letter waited, pressed flat, patient, heavy with a wax seal that did not belong to her. She turned, and the shadows took her, and below, Rowan laughed at something Finn said, never knowing. The man who ruled all of this stood at the far end of the hall, half in firelight, half in dark. Garrett, Alpha of the Black Pine, a mountain of a man, silver threaded through his dark hair, scars mapping a lifetime of holding this land against everything that wanted to take it. He watched his mate from across the room, and a feeling moved through his chest that he did not have a name for, and would not have spoken aloud if he had. She was the truest thing he had ever known. He had walked into border wars that turned the snow black. He had buried more of his own than he cared to count. And through all of it, every brutal season, there had been Rowan, waiting in the warm light, smelling of rain and lavender, dissolving the war in his blood with one look. He loved her, but Garrett was a proud man, a man whose whole life had been spent learning that the world is a knife, and the only way to survive it is to be a harder knife. And pride in a man like that is a crack in the foundation. You cannot see it, not in good weather, not in firelight, with your mate laughing and your sons safe and the hearth warm. You only see it when the storm comes. And the storm was coming, out past the windows, past the falling snow, past the dark teeth of the pines. Something had begun to move along the eastern border. Rogue wolves, lean and starving, and led by a cunning that had a name, were testing the edges of Black Pine land. And in the shadowed gallery, a letter waited for its moment. Rowan felt none of it. She only felt Finn climbing back into her arms, and Wyatt's weight gone soft and trusting against her chest, and Cole settling down beside her at last, leaning his golden head against her shoulder, the way he was getting almost too old to do. She gathered all three of her boys close in the firelight. She breathed them in, and she did not know, she could not have known, that this was the last quiet night the Black Pine Lodge would ever hold, that before the next moon rose, the gates would open, and the cold would come in, and everything she was would be dragged out into the freezing dark. That the soft little Omega they all underestimated was about to become something none of them had a name for. But that comes later. For now, there was only the fire, the snow, and a mother holding her sons, tapping her chest twice, whispering the oldest promise she knew. Be brave. I will always find you. The trap closed 3 nights later. It came the way these things always come, not with teeth, but with paper. A patrol returned from the eastern ridge before dawn, dragging a captured rogue between them. The beast was half-starved, its ribs sharp beneath matted fur, and it snarled and snapped all the way through the gates. But it was not the rogue that turned the morning cold. It was what they found in its saddlebag. A letter. A letter sealed in wax. Rowan's wax. The seal she pressed to every gentle thing in that lodge. The letters of comfort. The careful records of the wounded. The small folded notes she tucked beneath doors when a grieving wolf needed to know that someone, somewhere, still saw them. That seal. Her seal. And the words inside spelled out everything a rogue king would ever need to crack the black pine open like a nut in a fist. The patrol routes. The thin places along the eastern wall. The nights the larder ran low, and the warriors ran tired, and the watch grew thin. It carried her scent. That was the part no one in that hall could argue away. Lavender and rain pressed deep into the very fibers of the parchment, as though she had held it against her own skin while she wrote out the ruin of her own people. By the time the sun rose pale and thin over the snow, the whole lodge knew. And the whole lodge was waiting in the great hall when they brought her down. Rowan came down the wide stairs slowly, still half caught in sleep. Finn's small sock was still in her hand, the laundry she had been folding when the heavy knock came at her door. She did not understand it, not at first. She saw the crowd first, the faces turned up toward her in the gray morning light, and the cold in them, and the way the warriors she had stitched and soothed and sung to sleep now found somewhere else to look. She saw Garrett standing at the head of the hall, and the look on his face stopped her heart in her chest before a single word had been spoken, because it was not the face of her mate. It was the face of a judge. "Garrett," she said softly, "what is this?" He lifted the letter. The firelight caught the broken seal. The wax split clean down the middle like something gutted. "Tell me you did not write this." The hall went silent. Even the great hearth seemed to hold its breath. Rowan's eyes dropped to the parchment in his hand, and she felt the floor tilt beneath her bare feet, slow and sickening, like ice giving way underfoot. I have never seen that in my life. It carries your seal. Then the seal was stolen from me. It carries your scent, Rowan. His voice cracked on her name, and for half a breath she saw the man beneath the judge, the man who loved her, drowning somewhere far down behind his eyes. Your scent, pressed into the paper. And there, at the edge of the gallery, just behind Garrett's broad shoulder, Sloane watched, still as a held breath, her beautiful face arranged into a flawless picture of sorrow, one hand resting light against her throat, but her eyes betrayed her if anyone had thought to look. They were bright, wet, yes, but hungry beneath the wet. drinking down every moment of it like a woman dying of thirst. Rowan saw her, and in that single, terrible instant, she understood everything. The stolen seal, the handmaidens who had come too often and too eagerly to tidy her private chambers, the scent lifted from her own pillow while she slept the deep and trusting sleep of a woman who believed she was safe. She understood it all at once, the way you understand the shape of a wolf in the dark, a single heartbeat before it lunges, but understanding a thing and proving it. Those are two different mountains, and only one of them had a path to the top. It was her, Rowan said. Her voice did not shake. She lifted one trembling hand and pointed up at the gallery. Sloane, she did this. She has wanted my place since the first day she walked through these doors, and she has finally found a way to take it. Every head in the hall turned upward. Sloane pressed a delicate hand flat to her chest, her eyes going wide and brimming, a single perfect tear breaking loose to slide down one pale cheek. Me? She breathed. Rowan, I would never. After everything you have done for this pack, how can you stand there and say such a thing? To cover your own betrayal. It was perfect. That was the true horror of it. It was perfect. Because the council looked up at Sloane, weeping and wounded and lovely in her grief. And then they looked back at Rowan, the soft little Omega who held too much sway over too many strong men, who had always made the fiercest warriors gentle, who had always, just by walking into a room, made the proud betas feel small beside her quiet light. And Rowan saw the verdict written in their faces before the vote was ever called. She had spent her whole life giving herself away to these people, stitching them, soothing them, raising their children as her own, pouring herself out, one drop at a time, season after season, asking for nothing in return. And now, in the single moment she needed them to give something back, not one of them stood. Not the warrior whose torn arm she had sewn shut only 3 nights past. Not the young mother whose first hard birth she had walked through, hour by bloody hour, holding her hand and breathing with her until the dawn. They lowered their eyes to the floor, and they let the silence stretch, and they let it damn her. That was the wound that cut the deepest, deeper even, than the betrayal of the man she loved. It was the silence of every soul she had ever saved. Garrett began to descend the steps toward her. Each footfall rang off the high stone like the slow closing of a door, one after another, sealing her in. You have sold our blood to the wolves of the waste, he said, and his eyes flashed the brilliant, terrible gold of a challenged alpha. The man whose scars she had kissed in the dark. The man whose nightmares she had gathered into her own arms, whispering him back to himself when the old wars came hunting him through his sleep. That man was looking at her now, as though she were a stranger who had broken in wearing his wife's face. Rowan did not weep. For long years afterward, the few who still loved her would speak of it in low and wondering voices, how she stood in that freezing hall, accused and abandoned and utterly alone, and did not shed a single tear. Instead, she lifted her chin. "Look at me," she said, and something in her voice, something low and steady and unbreakable, made even Garrett go still. "I have given my life to this pack. I have bled for your warriors. I have raised your young as though they came from my own body. I have walked your dead to their rest and held your living through their darkest nights." Her voice rose now, clear and unbroken, ringing off the vaulted dark high above them all. "And I have never once asked you for anything but to be believed." She took a single step toward him. "So believe me now. Look into my eyes. Find the bond we have carried side by side through every winter of our lives, and tell me what you see there." For one suspended moment, Garrett wavered. Deep in his chest, where the mating bond lived and breathed, something pulled hard at him. Something old, something true. It cried out that this was wrong, all of it wrong, that this woman had never betrayed a living thing in all her days, that the scent of her was the scent of home itself, and home does not lie. He felt it. He would remember, until the last hour of his life, that he had felt it in that moment, and known it for the truth. But the war was already at his gates. His people were watching him, every last one of them, waiting to see what their alpha was made of. And his pride, that old hairline crack run deep through the foundation of him, split wide now under the crushing weight of his fear. An alpha cannot be made a fool. An alpha cannot be seen to bend before a beautiful liar's tears. And so Garrett did the thing that would haunt the rest of his days. He looked away. "If you would have me believe forged ink," Rowan said, very quietly now, watching the last warmth in him close against her like a door swinging shut, "over the bond we have shared for all these years, then you are not the alpha I once chose." The words struck him like a blade slid clean between the ribs. His whole face twisted, and his wounded pride reared up at last and swallowed down the final soft and human thing left in him. "Banishment," he said. The word dropped into the hall like a stone into a frozen lake. A gasp moved through the crowd. Even the cold council, even the hardest faces among them, had not believed he would carry it that far. "By the highest sun tomorrow," Garrett said, his voice gone to gravel, unable now to look at her at all. "She is cast into the deep woods, stripped of the crest, stripped of the pack. Let the cold judge what this hall cannot." And up in the gallery, where not one soul was watching her face any longer, Sloane smiled. The next day broke hard and bright and merciless. They brought Rowan to the heavy oak doors at the very height of the sun. They took the fur-lined cloak from her shoulders, the one stitched with the black pine crest, the one Garrett himself had wrapped around her on the night they bonded, his hands shaking, his voice rough with everything he could not say. They left her in a thin linen dress and a single threadbare wool shawl that the wind seized and tore at the very moment the great doors began to groan open. Beyond the threshold lay the deep woods, white, endless, a wilderness of jagged black pines and bottomless cold, where the exiled were sent to die, and where the snow swallowed their names long before spring ever came to ask after them. Rowan stood at the open gate and felt the freezing air reach in through the door to find her. She did not look at Garrett. She did not look up at Sloane, who stood draped in velvet and triumph on the high balcony, drinking in the sight of her rival walking out into the white. Instead, her eyes lifted, one last time, to the high window of the nursery tower, and there they were, three small faces, pressed white and desperate against the cold glass. Cole, Wyatt, Finn. She could not hear them through the thick stone and the howling wind, but she could see Finn's mouth opening wide, see him screaming her name into glass that would not let the sound through. She could see Wyatt's small fists hammering against a window that would not open, his whole body shaking with it. And she could see Cole, behind them both, holding his two brothers back with an expression far too old and far too broken for a boy of only 10 winters. Rowan's composure nearly shattered then. Everything in her body screamed at her to run, to break from the guards and climb the tower and hold those 3 boys one final time, to breathe them in, to never, ever let them go. But she could not, and she knew she could not. So she gave them the only thing she had left to give, slowly, where all 3 of them could see her clearly. She lifted her hand. She pressed it flat against her own chest, and she tapped, twice. Then she lifted that same hand, and she pointed out toward the deep and waiting woods. Be brave, wherever you are, whatever comes for you. Be brave, and I will always find you. Through the glass, she saw 3 small hands rise and answer. 3 small palms press flat against 3 small chests. Tap. Twice. And then Rowan turned away, before the sight of them could break her completely, and she walked out into the blinding white. The heavy gate slammed shut behind her. The sound of it boomed across the frozen waste like the tolling of a great bell for the dead. And just like that, the black pine had cast out its own beating heart, and did not yet understand the size of what it had done. Inside the lodge, Sloane was already calling for wine, already ordering the feast laid out, the roasted meat to mask the lingering scent of the woman she had destroyed, the heavy, spiced wine to drown that strange and creeping wrongness that had begun to settle over the hall the very instant those gates boomed shut. The beta elites laughed too loudly. They raised their cups too often and too high. But the lower wolves, the quiet ones, the ones Rowan had healed and held and carried through their worst hours, they did not laugh at all. They stood at the cold edges of that feast, and they felt the warmth drain slowly out of the whole world, and they could not have told you why. And they were afraid. High in the nursery tower, 3 boys stood at a window, watching a small dark figure grow smaller and smaller against the endless white, until the trees reached out and took her, and Cole, 10 years old, his golden eyes burning, slowly turned away from the glass. Pack your warmest cloaks, he said quietly. His 2 brothers turned to stare at him. Only meat from the larder. Flint. Furs. His young voice did not shake. It had dropped into something low and certain, something that sounded for the very first time like the leader he was born to become. We leave when the lodge sleeps. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and patient, drawing its white veil across the world. And far ahead now, alone in all that cold, Rowan walked deeper into the woods, not knowing that behind her, 3 small shadows had already chosen their path, and that nothing, not the cold, not the gates, not the word of any alpha alive, was going to keep them from following her into the dark. The first hours of exile were a war against the cold itself. Rowan trudged through snow that rose past her knees, each step a small battle won and immediately forgotten. The wind came down off the high places with teeth in it, stripping the warmth from her body faster than her body could ever hope to make it back. That was the cruelty no one in the warm lodge had ever understood about an Omega. Without the pack around her, without the warmth of bodies and bond and belonging, her kind cooled faster than any other wolf alive. The very gift that made her the soft heart of the black pine, that open and unguarded tenderness, left her with thinner walls against the killing dark. Her boots had soaked through within the first mile. Her feet had stopped truly hurting some while after that, and the not hurting frightened her far more than the pain ever had. She knew what that meant. She had nursed enough wolves through the freezing season to know exactly what it meant when the pain went quiet. Find shelter, she told herself, the words turning over and over in her slowing mind. Find shelter before the dark comes down, or do not trouble yourself to find anything at all. But there was something else moving beneath the cold, something worse than the cold. The bond. The mating bond, cut clean through by Garrett's single word and the slamming of those great gates, had not died the way a candle dies. It did not work that way. It tore, slow and ragged, like a living root dragged out of the earth, and every step she took away from him pulled at the raw and bleeding place where it had lived for so many years. It was a grief with a body, a grief she could feel in her teeth, in her ribs, in the deep marrow of her bones. And still she walked, because somewhere far behind her, in a tower she could no longer see, there were 3 small faces pressed white against cold glass, and the thought of them was the only fire she had left to carry. Back inside the lodge, the feast had warmed nothing at all. Sloane sat at the high table in a gown of deep red velvet, and she lifted her cup, and she smiled at the men who rose to toast her. And underneath all of it, something had begun to go quietly, deeply wrong. And she could not name it any better than the lowest scullery wolf in the hall could name it. The lodge had changed in the very moment those gates boomed shut. The air had gone sharp and thin. The shadows in the high corners seemed to lean inward, hungrier than before. Warriors who had feasted shoulder to shoulder for years now snapped at one another over nothing, over a spilled cup, over a wrong glance, a brushed shoulder, a word said too quickly. Their hackles rose for reasons not one of them could point to. The thing that had always kept them calm, the quiet, steadying warmth that one soft woman had cast over every soul beneath that roof, simply by breathing the same air, was gone. And without it, the black pine was learning, hour by slow hour, the true size of what it had thrown out into the snow. Garrett felt it worst of all. He sat in his great carved chair at the head of the feast, and the spiced wine turned to ash on his tongue, and the roasted meat sat like cold stones in his belly. He could not have told you what was wrong. He only knew that the hollow place behind his breastbone had begun to ache, a deep and gnawing emptiness where something warm and steady and certain used to live. He pressed one broad hand flat against his own chest over the ache and frowned into the firelight. Across the long hall, Sloane watched him do it, and her smile thinned at the edges. She had won. She knew she had won. The Omega was gone, cast into the white to die, and the throne beside the Alpha sat empty and waiting. And yet the man would not look at her with the eyes she wanted. He kept pressing that hand to his chest, kept staring into the fire as though searching the flames for a face that was no longer there. No matter, she told herself, and lifted her cup again. The dead do not haunt for long. He will forget. They always forget. She did not yet understand that some bonds do not break. They only bleed. High in the nursery tower, 3 boys waited for the lodge to sleep. Cole stood at the cold window long after his younger brothers had grown restless behind him. He watched the torches gutter out one by one along the walls below. He watched the great hall slowly empty, the laughter thin and fade, the drunken warriors stumble off at last toward their beds. He was 10 years old. He had his father's golden eyes. He had his father's broad shoulders coming in, the size of him already promising the giant he would one day become. He had his father's name waiting for him like a heavy crown he was not yet grown enough to wear. But he had something his father had somewhere lost along the way. He remembered her hands. He remembered every fever she had walked him through in the long dark of the night. He remembered every time his own predatory instincts had risen up too large and too black for his small body to contain them. The rage and the hunger of the wolf clawing at the inside of a boy. And he remembered how she had sung them quiet, every single time, never once afraid of what he was, never once flinching from the thing inside him that frightened even himself. She is out there, Finn whispered from the bed. His small voice trembled. He clutched the little carved wolf in both hands, the one she had whittled for him beside the fire on a winter evening that already felt a lifetime gone. She is out there in the cold right now, and Father is the one who put her there. She is not even our mother by blood, Wyatt muttered, but his voice cracked clean down the middle on the last word, and his small claws were sliding out and in, the way they always did when there was no one near enough to gather him close. Everyone keeps saying it, over and over. She is not our blood, as if that is supposed to mean something. Cole turned slowly from the window, and when he finally spoke, his young voice dropped into something low and resonant, something that made both his brothers go utterly still where they sat. Blood is only lineage, Cole said quietly. She gave us our souls. The room went silent. Even the wind outside seemed to pause to listen. A wolf is bound to its alpha. Father told us that 100 times, and 100 times we believed him. Cole crossed the room to the heavy wardrobe and pulled it open, dragging out the thickest of their winter cloaks. But a cub is bound to its mother. That is older than any law Father ever taught us. And she is the only mother that any of us has ever known. He threw a cloak to each of his brothers. We are the heirs of the black pine, he said, and there was iron in it now, the first cold gleam of the leader he was born to be. And we do not abandon our own. Wyatt was on his feet before the cloak had even settled across his shoulders. Finn scrambled up after him, scrubbing the last of the tears from his face with the back of one small hand. And there was no fear left in him now. None at all. Only purpose, burning clean and bright. The 3 of them slipped from the tower like shadows poured from a cup. The lodge was a frighteningly easy thing to leave. The guards were either deep in Sloane's wine or too unsettled by the strange wrongness creeping through the halls to pay any mind to 3 small shapes moving low and quiet through the dark. Cole led them down through the old siege tunnels beneath the armory, and there was a cruelty in that. though none of the boys felt it, because it was Rowan herself who had first shown them those tunnels, a season ago, laughing, in a game of hide and seek that had filled the whole lodge with the rare and ringing sound of children's joy. She could never have dreamed that the secret passages she revealed only to delight them would one night carry them out into a storm to drag her back from the edge of death. They came up into the biting wind a long mile beyond the walls, and there, in the open, with the lodge a distant dying glow behind them, and the deep woods a solid wall of black ahead, they shifted. 3 young wolves shook the snow from their coats, one the deep black of a starless night, golden eyes burning low and steady. That was Cole, one of fierce and heavy brindle, already grown too large for his years, all coiled muscle and bared young fangs. That was Wyatt. And one small and quick and bright, the color of a banked fire, ember red against the endless white. That was Finn. They dropped their noses to the snow. And there, faint beneath a fresh fall, almost gone, but not quite gone, lavender and rain, her scent, a single thread of warmth running out into the freezing dark, to 3 young alphas who had been raised in her arms, who knew that scent the way they knew the beating of their own small hearts. It might as well have been a road of fire laid burning across the snow. They lifted their heads as one, and they ran. Far ahead now, Rowan had finally fallen. Her legs simply would not carry her through one more drift. They folded beneath her, and she went down into the snow, and for a long and terrible moment she did not have the strength left to rise. She had found a shallow hollow beneath the upturned roots of a great fallen pine. It was not shelter, not really, but it was something. A wall of frozen earth at her back, a roof of dead and tangled roots between her body and the worst of the screaming wind. She crawled into it on her hands and knees, and she pulled her thin shawl tight around her shoulders, and she drew herself into a small tight knot of cold and shaking limbs. Her lips had gone blue. She could feel it. She could feel her own thoughts beginning to slow and soften and drift, the way still water slows just before it freezes solid. This was the part she had warned others about, in another life, in a warm room that had smelled of wood smoke and crushed healing herbs. The terrible gentleness that comes at the very end of freezing. The drowsy, lying warmth that is not warmth at all. The sweet, soft voice that whispers it would be so easy now, so easy, to simply close your eyes and rest a while, just for a while, just for a moment. Rowan's eyes began to close, and the last clear thought she had, before the cold reached up to take her down, was not for herself. It was a prayer, a small and desperate and selfless prayer that Garrett, whatever else he was, whatever cruelty he had done to her at the end, would be a good father to those 3 boys, in all the years she would now never live to see, that he would hold them when the fevers came in the dark, that he would learn to sing the rage out of Wyatt's chest, the way she had tried so patiently to teach him, that someone, anyone at all, would remember to tell them often that they were loved beyond all measure. Her eyes closed fully, and the cold leaned in close, like a patient thing that had all the time in the world. A twig snapped, sharp, close, a sound that belonged to neither wind nor snow. Rowan's eyes flew open, through the howling white, 3 shapes were moving toward her out of the black tree line. Her heart, sluggish and slow in her chest, gave a single frightened lurch. Wolves. Of course it would be wolves. Of course it would end this way in the end. Scavengers come down to take what the cold had not yet quite finished. She tried to lift one hand to ward them off and found she could barely move it at all. But then the shapes drew closer through the swirling snow, and the black wolf in the lead let out a sound that froze her far more deeply than any winter ever could. A soft, distressed whine. A sound she knew. A sound she had heard 1,000 times in the warm dark of the nursery. The small frightened cry of a boy who had woken from a nightmare and needed, more than anything in the world, to be told that the world was still safe and she was still near. "No," Rowan croaked. Her voice was barely a thread of breath. "No, no, 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 no." The brindle wolf reached her first and pressed a warm, wet nose hard against her frozen cheek, whining low and anxious in his throat. The small ember-red pup scrambled straight up into her lap, burrowing against her front, crying out in that high and desperate voice she would have known anywhere on this earth. "No," she sobbed, trying to push them away with hands that would not close. "No, Cole, Wyatt, Finn, no, you cannot be here. Do you hear me? You have to go back. You have to turn around and go back right now, all 3 of you." The black wolf shifted in a blur of motion and falling snow, and then Cole was kneeling beside her in the drift, his 10-year-old face set with a grim and unshakable determination that broke her heart clean down the middle. Without a single word, he pulled a heavy fur from his pack and wrapped it tight around her shaking shoulders, tucking it close around her, the very way she had tucked 1,000 warm blankets around him through all the winters of his small life. "You have to go back," Rowan pleaded, and now the tears came hot and fast down her freezing cheeks. "Listen to me, please. If your father wakes and finds you gone, if he lets himself believe that I stole you away from him in the night, he will hunt me to the ends of the earth and he will kill me. A banished Omega, caught alone in the woods with the 3 heirs of the pack. Do you understand how that looks? Do you understand what he would have to do?" Wyatt shifted next. He knelt down beside his brother in the snow, and he reached into his coat, and he drew out a careful bundle of dried meat, pressing it into her cold and useless hands. "You do not protect us, Rowan," the 9-year-old said, and his voice was so steady, so terribly, impossibly certain. His golden eyes flashed bright in the dark, and for one long moment, he did not look like a boy at all. "We protect you." Something deep in Rowan's chest cracked all the way open. Finn would not shift back. He stayed in his small wolf form, and he pressed his entire ember-warm body tight against her chest, right over her slowing heart, radiating heat into her like a live coal pulled fresh and glowing from the hearth. And then Cole and Wyatt shifted too, back into their wolf shapes, massive for their years, and they curled themselves around her flanks, trapping the precious warmth beneath the furs. 3 young bodies wrapped tight around one freezing woman in the hollow of a fallen tree. The shaking in Rowan's limbs began, slowly, by inches, to ease. The blue began to leave her lips, and there, in the frozen heart of a wilderness where she had been sent all alone to die, a new pack had quietly knit itself together around her. smaller than the one that had cast her out, fiercer by far than the one that had cast her out, and bound together by something the whole great lodge of the black pine had somewhere forgotten how to feel. Rowan wept into Finn's warm red fur, not from the cold now, not from fear of dying, but because she had walked out through those gates believing in her deepest heart that she had lost every single thing that had ever mattered to her. And the world had answered that despair by sending her the only 3 souls who would never, in all their lives, let her go. "My brave boys," she whispered into the dark, gathering them close at last with arms that were finally, slowly, beginning to warm again. "My brave, foolish, impossible boys. What have you done? What have you gone and done?" Far behind them, the great lodge slept on, and did not yet know that its high tower stood empty, and its heirs were gone into the night. But the woods knew the 3 small hunters were out in the cold, and the woods held far older things than cold. Somewhere out in that screaming white, beyond the small firelight of a love that had refused to lie down and die, yellow eyes had begun to open in the dark. Lean shapes, hollow-bellied shapes, mad with a hunger that had hunted these woods for longer than any lodge had stood, and drawn now, unerringly, toward the one thing the wilderness could never resist: the warm, living scent of prey. But that came riding in with the storm, and for now, in the close, warm hollow of the fallen pine, there was only the heat of 3 small bodies pressed against the cold, and a mother's whispered promise finally, against all the odds of the world, made good. "Be brave. I will always find you." She had told them that so many times, on so many nights. She had never once imagined, in all her quiet years, that it would be the 3 of them who came through the dark and found her. The storm came down in the deep of the night like a living thing. It did not arrive. It descended. One moment there was only the steady fall of snow, soft and patient, and the next the whole world had vanished into a screaming wall of white, the wind tearing through the dead pines like a chorus of the drowned. In the hollow of the fallen tree, the 4 of them held on to one another, and to the thin thread of warmth they had built between their bodies. And it was somewhere in the very worst of that storm that the bond crisis took Rowan. It began as a heat, a strange, wrong heat, rising up from the very center of her, deep in the place where the mating bond had lived, and where it now lay torn and bleeding in the dark of her chest. It spread upward through her ribs, into her throat, up into her face, and it had nothing of comfort in it, nothing of warmth. It was the heat of sickness. Her kind had an old name for it: the bond fever. It was the body's answer to a bond cut while it still lived. A mate taken cleanly by death was a grief the heart could, in time, learn to carry, but a bond severed by betrayal, a bond cut clean through while the other half of it still walked the earth, still breathed, still ached somewhere beyond the trees. That was a wound that would not close. It festered. It burned. It turned the body against itself, and now it had come for her. Here, in the cold, at the very worst hour it could possibly have chosen. Rowan? Cole had shifted back into his boy shape, and he crouched low over her, his young face drawn tight with a fear he was fighting with everything he had not to show. Rowan, your skin. You are burning up. You are too hot. You are far too hot. I am fine, she breathed. But she was not fine. They both knew she was not fine. The fever climbed. Her thoughts began to scatter and reach and grasp, clutching at the bond that was no longer there, the way a tongue reaches again and again for the raw gap where a tooth has just been pulled. She could feel the exact shape of where Garrett used to be inside her. The precise, aching, hollow shape of his absence, carved into the center of her like a wound carved into stone. And the cruelest part of the bond fever, the part that made even strong wolves weep in the telling of it, was that it made her want him, even now, even after all of it, even here. The body did not understand betrayal. The body could not be taught it. The body only knew that half of itself had been ripped away, and it screamed for the missing half with a need that had no shame in it, and no sense in it, and not one drop of mercy. Garrett, she whispered before she could stop the name from forming, her head rolling weakly against the frozen root behind her. Garrett. And she hated herself for it. Hated the way his name still fit so easily into her mouth. Hated that some deep and animal part of her, even now, even freezing, even dying in the snow he had thrown her into, still reached out across the howling dark for the very man who had put her there. Wyatt pressed closer against her side, a low and unhappy whine working in his throat. Why does she keep saying his name? He growled. And buried somewhere deep in the anger was the raw hurt of a child who did not understand. He left her here. He left her here to die. Why does she still want him? It is not her, Cole said quietly. He did not fully understand it himself. Not yet. Not at 10 years old. But he understood enough of it. It is the bond. It is making her sick. Father broke it, but he broke it the wrong way. And now it is hurting her from the inside out. She cannot help it. It is not really her. Rowan's whole body began to shake, not from the cold this time, from the fever racking through her in great rolling waves, the chill and the burn warring beneath her thin skin, her teeth chattering hard, her hands clutching uselessly at the air, at the furs, at nothing. And the boys, who had crossed a death storm to keep the cold away from her, now stood face to face with a thing that no fur and no fire could fight. But they did not run. That was the moment, if any living soul had been there to witness it, when three boys quietly became something far greater than three boys. Finn climbed up onto her heaving chest and pressed his small palms flat against her burning cheeks, the very way she used to press her own cool hands to his face when the childhood fevers came for him in the night. Stay, he begged her in that small, high, trembling voice. Stay, stay, stay. You always told me to stay. You always told me. Now you have to stay too. Cole gripped her hand in both of his and would not let it go, anchoring her to the world, his golden eyes locked hard on her face, refusing with all his young will to let her drift away from them. And Wyatt, fierce, furious, frightened Wyatt, pressed his forehead down against her shoulder and did the only thing his small heart could think to do. He began to hum. It was clumsy. It was badly off-key. It was a broken, halting, stumbling thing that barely held its shape. But it was the song. Her song. The wordless lullaby she had hummed into each of their small chests on 100 frightened nights. The one that had drawn the darkness out of them every time, when their own wild instincts rose up too large and too black for their little bodies to contain. Now they sang it back to her. 3 small, shaking, uneven voices raised together in the screaming heart of the storm, humming a mother's lullaby to the mother who had first taught it to them, trying, with everything they had in them, to call her back from the burning dark she was slipping into. And Rowan, drifting, fevered, half lost to the world already, heard it. She heard it through the howl of the wind and the roar of her own fevered blood, that small, familiar, off-key little tune, clumsy, imperfect, theirs, unmistakably, achingly theirs. And it reached her where nothing else on earth could have reached her. Her wandering, scattering mind caught on it like a falling hand catching hold of a rope at the very last moment. She did not reach for Garrett again after that. She reached for them. "My boys," she breathed, and her shaking hands found them in the dark, one settling on Finn's small warm back, one gripped tight inside Cole's, her fevered cheek turning to rest against Wyatt's bowed and humming head. "I am here. I am still here. I promise you. I am not going anywhere." She turned her burning face into the warmth of them, and slowly, by the smallest and most stubborn of degrees, she let that clumsy lullaby pull her back, inch by inch, from the edge of the dark. The fever did not break that night. It would burn on in her for some time yet, rising and falling like a tide, but it stopped winning, because every time it tried to drag her back down into the dark, into the empty, screaming, hollow place where the bond had been torn away. 3 small voices were waiting there, humming her home, refusing, with a child's pure and absolute stubbornness, to let her go anywhere they could not follow. This was the truest intimacy Rowan had ever known in all her life. Not the bond of a mate. That had been real once, yes, real and deep and warm, and it had very nearly killed her in the breaking of it. This was something else entirely, something deeper and older and stronger, the fierce, unbreakable closeness of 3 children who had walked willingly into a death storm for her sake, who held her burning body through the longest and darkest night of her whole life, who sang her own love back into her, note by clumsy note, when she had grown too sick and too tired to hold on to it herself. She had spent her entire life being the one who stayed, the one who held, the one who soothed, the one who sat up through the long, dark hours so that someone else could rest. And now, for the first time she could ever remember, somebody stayed for her. The roles had turned all the way around in the night. The mother was the one being mothered now. The healer was the one being healed. The one who gave was, at long last, receiving. And there, in the warm tangle of furs and small bodies, in that broken, beautiful lullaby, Rowan finally understood a thing she had never once let herself believe in all her years, that she was worth staying for, that all those long years of giving herself away, drop by drop, season by season, had never once been the price she had to pay in order to be loved, that she had been worthy of love the entire time, just as she was, even now, even here, even with nothing left in her hands to give. The boys had not crossed that storm because she was useful to them. They had crossed it because she was theirs. And nothing, no law, no word, no banishment, no gate slammed shut in the cold, was ever going to change that simple and unbreakable fact. Far behind them, in the great lodge, The lie was at last beginning to come undone. Garrett could not sleep. He had retreated to his chambers when the feast finally guttered and died, and he had lain himself down in the great bed, and the bed had felt to him like a slab of cold and lifeless stone. The ache behind his breastbone had grown all through the long night, hour by hour, until it was no longer a mere ache, but a tearing, a pulling, a deep and grinding wrongness he could no longer pretend away as the work of too much wine. Something is wrong. The thought would not leave him be. It circled and circled him in the dark, the way a wolf circles a dying fire, patient and certain and waiting. Something is wrong with my sons. He could not have said where the certainty came from. He only knew with the deep and wordless knowing of a father that he needed to see them, that he needed to lay his own eyes upon his 3 boys and know them safe and warm in their beds, and that until he did, there would be no rest for him anywhere in this world. So he rose. He pulled a heavy robe across his shoulders, and he climbed the long spiral stair to the nursery tower with a single guard trailing at his heels, telling himself the whole long way up that he was being a fool, that they were sleeping soundly, that he would look in upon them and feel the old fool and go back down to his cold and empty bed. He pushed open the heavy oak door. "Boys," he said into the dark of the room, "up now. It is time for the evening blood rye." The words died in his throat. The fire in the hearth had burned all the way down to gray and lifeless embers. No one had fed it through the night. No one had banked it against the cold. The beds stood perfectly, precisely made, untouched, smooth, cold, and the great wardrobe stood gaping wide open, stripped bare of the boys' thickest winter cloaks, the empty wooden hangers swinging gently, slowly, back and forth in the draught. A single window banged in a steady rhythm against its stone frame, thrown open to the night, letting the screaming wind of the storm pour freely into the empty room. Garrett crossed the floor in 3 enormous strides. He gripped the cold stone of the windowsill in both hands and leaned far out into the teeth of the storm. And there, below him, in a single sheltered patch of snow that the wind had not yet swept clean away, 3 small sets of paw prints, leading away from the lodge, leading straight and sure and unhesitating toward the black tree line of the deep woods, toward the very place he had sent her to die. The sound that tore its way out of Garrett in that moment was not the roar of an alpha. It was not the roar of a king or a ruler or the proud lord of all the territory. It was the raw, breaking animal scream of a father who had just understood, all at once and far too late, the full and terrible weight of exactly what he had done. "Gone!" he bellowed, and the single word shook the very stones of the ancient tower around him. "They are gone, out into the woods. My sons are out in the deep woods." He whirled on the white-faced guard behind him. "Wake the lodge. Wake every able body under this roof. Trackers, hunters, every wolf who can hold a torch and run through snow. Now, now." The guard turned and fled, stumbling down the stairs, and Garrett stood alone in the empty nursery, in the cold, pouring draught, staring at the gently swinging hangers and the dead gray fire, and the small carved wolf that Finn had left behind, forgotten in his haste, upon his pillow. He reached down. He picked it up. It was so small in his huge, scarred hand. And the truth came down upon him then, like the storm itself, all at once, burying him. His sons had not been taken. They had chosen. They had looked at what he had done. They had stood at that high window and watched him cast their mother out into the snow on the word of forged ink and a beautiful woman's tears. And they had decided, the three of them together, that they would rather walk hand in hand into a death storm at her side than spend one more single night beneath the roof of the Alpha who had betrayed her. His own children had weighed him in the balance against the woman he had thrown away like something broken, and they had found him wanting, and they had chosen her. The great hall, when Garrett finally descended into it, had already shattered into open chaos. The long feast tables lay overturned across the stone. Warriors stumbled half-dressed from their beds, dragging furs across their shoulders, snatching torches down from the walls against the howling dark outside. The strange, creeping wrongness that had haunted the lodge all through the long night had a name now at last, and the name of it was terror. Garrett came down the wide stairs, no longer wearing the face of a proud and certain king. His eyes had bled from gold all the way to a frantic, desperate crimson. The eyes of a father with his children lost somewhere out in the killing cold. "My sons are in the deep woods," he thundered, seizing the captain of his guard by the iron collar of his tunic and nearly lifting the man from his feet. "Every warrior to the gates, every tracker on the scent before the storm buries it, and if a single one of you drags his feet this night, that wolf will answer to me with his hide." And then Sloane was there, sweeping forward through the chaos in her deep velvet gown, her face arranged once more into a flawless mask of fresh and tender distress, her pale hands fluttering at her throat like wounded birds. "Garrett, my lord," she cried out, "the Omega. She must have lured them out somehow. That treacherous, scheming creature. She has stolen them away to use against you, to hold them as hostages against the pack. I am certain of it. I am sure of it, down to my bones." She got no further than that, because Garrett slowly turned, and he looked at her. And for the first time in long and clouded months, the haze that had fogged his mind, the soft and subtle and patient poison she had been dripping so carefully into his ear for so long, tore clean and sudden away in the harsh white light of his terror. He looked at Sloane, and at last, at long and bitter last, he truly saw her. "She did not lure them," he said. His voice had dropped low, into something quiet and flat and terrible, something that made the whole shattered hall fall silent and still around the two of them. "My sons took their warmest cloaks. They took meat from the larder with their own hands. They took flint and furs, and they went out through the old siege tunnels in the dead black of night of their own will to follow a woman out into a storm." He took one slow step toward her, and Sloane, despite herself, took a step back. "Those are not the frightened acts of children who were stolen in the night, Sloane. Those are the deliberate acts of children running toward something, running toward the one soul left in all this world that they still trust." His crimson eyes burned into her face. "And running away from me, my lord. I only ever—" "The letter carried her scent," Garrett said, soft and merciless. "Lifted from her private chamber. lifted, I would wager, from her very pillow while she slept. And tell me, Sloane, who in all this lodge came and went so freely from the Omega's private rooms? Who was forever sending her handmaidens to attend her? Who, of every soul beneath this roof, stood to gain so much, the very moment that she was gone from it? Sloane's lovely face had gone as white as the snow piling against the windows. If my sons freeze to death out in those woods tonight, Garrett said, and he had gone very quiet now, and the quiet of him was 1,000 times more terrible than any roar could ever have been. Because of a sentence that you whispered me into passing, then there will be no corner of this whole wide earth where you are safe from me. Do you understand my meaning? I will tear the very world apart with my hands to find my children. And when that is done, I will come back and I will look very closely into the truth of how they came to be out there at all. He shoved past her, hard, sending her staggering. And he left Sloane standing alone and trembling in the very center of the great hall, the velvet of her gown pooling around her feet, the absolute and total power she had lied and schemed and very nearly murdered to secure now unraveling around her in the space of a few short breaths. The pack she had believed was already won looked upon her now with the first cold and dawning light of suspicion in their eyes, and the warriors poured out through the great gates in a river of streaming torchlight, the storm swallowing the flames, the Alpha running at their head into the same screaming white that held a fevered woman and 3 small boys in the hollow of a fallen tree. The pack had not noticed, not until the dark had come all the way down over them, not until the heirs were already long gone into the night, and out in that screaming white, beneath a low roof of dead and tangled roots, Rowan held her 3 sons close against her burning chest and hummed their own lullaby back to them through the rolling waves of the fever. While somewhere out in the storm, on every side of them now, slow and patient and certain, the yellow eyes drew closer through the trees. The old hunters of the deep woods had caught the warm scent of the living, and in the hollow of the fallen pine, the 4 of them were no longer alone in the dark. By the gray hour before dawn, the storm had begun, at last, to break. The wind eased, the howling softened to a low moan, and then to nothing, and a thin, cold light began to seep through the dead pines, turning the world a pale and silent blue. Rowan woke to the weight of 3 sleeping boys against her body. The fever had ebbed in the night. It had not gone, not entirely. It still smoldered low in her chest like a banked coal. But she could think again. She could feel her own hands again. And for the first time since the gates had closed behind her, she was warm. She lay very still, so as not to wake them. And she looked at their sleeping faces in the gray light. Cole, his golden eyes finally closed. The heavy weight of leadership eased for a few stolen hours from his young face. Wyatt, one fist still curled tight even in sleep, as though guarding against something in his dreams. And little Finn, his small mouth open, breathing soft and even against her shoulder. The carved wolf gone, left behind on a pillow in a tower a world away. And looking at them, in that quiet blue dawn, Rowan came up against the hardest choice of her life, because the path before her had split into 2. She could see it now, clearly, in the cold morning light. 2 roads, and she had to choose one. and there was no road that did not cost her something she could not bear to lose. The first road ran deeper into the woods, away, out, into the wild and trackless country beyond the reach of any lodge or any alpha or any law that had ever named her traitor. She could take these 3 boys, and she could run, and she could keep on running until the black pine was nothing but a story they barely remembered. She knew how to live off the wild land. She had healing in her hands, and warmth in her body, and a love for these 3 that would carry her across any distance. They could be free. No counsel, no cold faces, no betrayal waiting behind every kind word. Just the 4 of them, and the open country, and a quiet life where no one would ever again look at her and see a thing to be used and then thrown away. It was a beautiful dream, and it would be a lie. Because Rowan knew, in the deep and honest place beneath the dream, what that road truly meant. It meant raising these boys as fugitives, as exiles, always running, always looking back over their shoulders. 3 young alphas, heirs to a great pack, growing up wild and hunted and small, their birthright stolen from them not by Garrett's cruelty, but by her own fear. Cole was born to lead. She had seen it in him since he could barely walk. The pack was in his blood, in his bones, in the set of his small shoulders. To take him from it, to deny him the thing he was made for, that would not be saving him. That would be stealing his future to soothe her own wounded heart. And there was the other road. The road back. Back to the lodge that had condemned her. Back through those gates that had slammed shut in her face. Back to face the man who had thrown her into the snow, and the woman who had engineered her ruin, and a council of cold faces who had looked at the floor while she was damned. Back into the lion's mouth. It would be the most dangerous thing she had ever done. A banished Omega did not simply walk home. By every law of the pack, her life was forfeit the moment she stepped back through those gates. But it was the only road that gave the boys their future. And it was the only road, Rowan understood slowly, that gave her back her own, because to run was to let the lie win. To run was to spend the rest of her life agreeing with the verdict. Yes, I am the thing you said I was. Yes, I will slink away into the dark and trouble your warm lodge no more. And she was done slinking. She had been small for these people her whole life. She had made herself soft and quiet and useful and easy to overlook, because that was what an Omega was supposed to be. And she had believed it all the way down until the night 3 children dragged her back from death and showed her she was worth more than all her years of quiet giving. She was not going to run. She was going to walk back through those gates with her head high, and she was going to take what was hers. You are thinking very loudly, Cole murmured. His golden eyes had opened. He was watching her face in the gray light with that unsettling, too-old gaze of his. Go back to sleep, she whispered. You are going to make us go back. It was not a question. The boy missed nothing. He never had. Back to him. Rowan was quiet for a long moment. What do you want, Cole? She asked him softly. Not what you think I want to hear. The truth. If you could choose any road in the world this morning, which would you walk? Cole considered it with the gravity of a much older soul. I want to go home, he admitted at last, very quietly, as though it shamed him. I hate him for what he did to you. I do, but it is still home. Finn cries for it in his sleep. And Wyatt. He glanced at his fierce, sleeping brother. Wyatt needs the pack. He needs to be around others like him, or the wildness gets too big in him. You know that. You are the only one who has ever been able to calm it. But you cannot be the only one. Not forever. Rowan's throat tightened. He was 10 years old. And he had just laid out, more clearly than she ever could have, exactly why the road back was the only road. Then we go back, she said. Cole's eyes searched hers. He will be there. He might. I know what he might do. She brushed the dark hair back from his forehead. But I am not walking back through those gates the way I walked out of them, sweet boy. I walked out with my head down because I let them tell me what I was. I am walking back in to tell them. Something kindled in Cole's golden eyes then. Something fierce and proud and glad. Good, he said. Far off, the lodge was already pouring its hunters into the woods, but Rowan and the boys were not the only thing moving through the gray dawn. Somewhere out in the trees, the yellow eyes had drawn close in the night. They had circled the hollow through the worst of the storm, patient, waiting, held back only by the wind that scattered the scent of warm prey. Now the wind had died, and the scent hung clear and rich in the still cold air. The hunters of the deep woods were closing in, and they did not hunt alone. For these were no ordinary scavengers. The lean and starving rogues that haunted the deep woods had a master now. They had been gathered and fed just enough, and pointed like a blade at the heart of the black pine, by a hand that worked from inside the lodge itself, and that hand had not been idle the night the cubs slipped out. A single word passed through the blind spot in the eastern wall to a runner waiting in the dark, had told the rogue king the one thing he could never have dreamed of on his own, that the 3 heirs of the Black Pine were out in the open, unguarded, far from any wall. Crane had not stumbled upon that hollow in the snow by the luck of a hungry beast. He had been pointed straight to it. Back within those walls, the lie was beginning to rot from the inside. It started with a frightened girl who could no longer carry what she knew. One of Sloane's own handmaidens, cornered in the chaos of the search, broke and wept out the truth. She had only done as she was told. She sobbed. She had only taken the scent from the Omega's pillow because Lady Sloane had commanded it, and Lady Sloane was not a woman one disobeyed. She had never dreamed it would end with the young masters lost out in the snow. An old soldier named Hale heard it. He had served the Black Pine since before Garrett ever wore the crown, and he had never once trusted the beautiful cold woman who had wound her way to the Alpha's side. He had watched her for a long time, and now, at last, the thread she had hidden so carefully lay loose in his weathered old hand. He did not run shouting to Garrett. Garrett was already deep in the trees, half mad with fear for his sons. Hale simply began, quietly, to follow the thread. It led him to the gate watch, and to a thing one of them had seen but never spoken of. Lady Sloane, walking the eastern wall alone in the dead black hours. Again and again and again. Always to the same blind spot in the stone. The one place no patrol ever covered. The place where a message might be passed through into the dark. The place where a pack is sold. Hale's old blood ran cold in his veins. This was not the small jealousy of a woman who wanted a throne. This was something far larger and far darker. The forged letter had named the pack's every weakness, and someone had been carrying those weaknesses out through the wall, into the woods, to the very rogues now circling the Alpha's lost children. The Omega had betrayed no one, but someone surely had, and out in the gray woods, Garrett ran at the head of his hunters, following 3 small sets of tracks half buried by the storm, his heart a clenched fist in his chest. He did not yet know what Hale was uncovering behind him. He knew only that every step carried him deeper into the place he had sent his mate to die, and that with every step the dread in him grew. He had begun, somewhere in the long night, to truly understand the size of his mistake, not the failure of judgment that had let a liar lead him by the nose, the deeper one. He had looked into the eyes of the truest soul he had ever known, and she had asked him, simply, to believe her, to look at the bond they had carried together through every hard winter of their lives, and to trust it over a piece of forged paper. And he had looked away. That was the thing he could not outrun, no matter how fast he drove his warriors through the snow. He had not truly been deceived into condemning her. The deception had only given him permission. In his deepest heart, in the place where the bond still ached, he had known all along that she was innocent, and he had chosen his pride over that knowing. He had chosen to look strong in front of his pack over being right in front of his own soul. "I will find them," he said aloud to no one, his breath clouding white in the freezing air. "I will find all of them, and I will spend the rest of my life." He did not finish it, because just then, far ahead through the trees, carried thin and faint on the still morning air, came a sound that turned his blood to ice, the snarl of rogues, and beneath it, high and small and terrified, a child's scream. Garrett's crimson eyes flew wide, and whatever was left of the proud and careful king burned away in a single instant, leaving only the father and the wolf and a roar that tore from his chest as he broke into a dead run toward the sound of his children in the jaws of the dark. In the hollow of the fallen pine, the 4 of them had risen to face the morning, and the morning had bared its teeth. The rogues came out of the trees on every side, lean, scarred, mad-eyed with hunger, and at their head, vast and grotesque, a great scarred alpha with the cold and calculating patience of a thing that had been waiting all night for the wind to die. Rowan pushed the boys behind her. She was still weak, still fevered, still a barefoot woman in a torn linen dress, standing between 3 children and a wall of killers. But she did not run. She had made her choice in the blue dawn. She was done being small. She was done looking down. She was done letting the strong decide what the gentle were worth. "Stay behind me," she said quietly to her boys, and there was something new in her voice now, something that had not been there when she walked out through the gates. "Whatever happens, whatever you see, stay behind me and be brave." 3 small hands rose and tapped 3 small chests, twice. And Rowan turned to face the deep woods rising up to swallow them, and the thing inside her, the thing she had hidden her whole life, the thing they had all mistaken for weakness, began at last to wake. The scarred alpha lunged first. He came low and fast across the snow, a mountain of muscle and matted fur, his yellow eyes fixed not on Rowan, but on the small bodies huddled behind her. He knew exactly what they were. 3 young heirs of the black pine, half grown and far from the safety of their walls, were a prize worth more than a season of meat to a creature like Crane. And Cole met him in the air. The black wolf launched himself up and over Rowan's shoulder with a fury that did not belong in a body so young, and his small jaws closed hard on the rogue leader's throat. For one single heartbeat, it was magnificent. A boy of 10, heir to a great pack, fighting like something out of an old and bloody legend, clinging with all his strength to the throat of a killer 3 times his size. But size is size. Crane gave one violent twist of his great body, and Cole was torn loose and flung through the air like a stone from a sling. He struck the frozen trunk of a pine with a sound that stopped Rowan's heart in her chest, and he crumpled down into the snow at its base, and he did not move. Cole! Wyatt was already moving. The brindle wolf hit the rogue's flank with everything that was in him, claws raking through the matted fur, young fangs snapping for any soft and vital thing he could reach. He was fierce. He was utterly fearless. He fought with the wild and desperate heart of a boy who would tear the world apart to defend his family. And it was not enough. A second rogue peeled away from the closing ring and slammed into him broadside, a massive paw driving him flat into the snow, the whole crushing weight of it forcing the breath from his small lungs. Wyatt thrashed and snarled and could not break free. And the killer lowered its dripping jaws slowly toward the bared back of his small neck. "No," Rowan whispered. And then she screamed it. "No!" Finn was crying out, a high and broken and terrible sound, straining to reach his pinned brother and held back only by Rowan's arm thrown hard across his small chest. Cole lay still and bleeding at the foot of the tree. Wyatt lay pinned and snarling beneath a killer's paw. And the rest of the pack was closing in around them, a slow and tightening ring of yellow eyes and bared teeth, in no hurry at all now, savoring the moment the way starving things savor a kill that cannot run. This was the moment Rowan had feared above every other, not her own death. She had made her peace with that the very moment the gates slammed shut behind her. This, her boys, dying in the snow, dying because they had loved her too much to let her go. Dying because they had walked willingly into this death to keep her warm through the night, and now the dark had come at last to collect all 4 of them together. "We are going to die." The thought went through her, and the despair of it was colder than any winter the deep woods had ever known. "My boys are going to die defending me, and there is nothing I can do. I am only a soft thing. I am only a healer, a soother, a gentle and useless little." And there, at the very bottom of her despair, in the deepest and most broken place inside of her, something pushed back. For her whole life, Rowan had been told exactly what she was: soft, gentle, submissive, a soother of tempers, a healer of wounds, a calmer of storms in other people, a weak thing to be sheltered by the strong and used by the cunning, and quietly thrown away the moment she was no longer convenient to keep. She had believed every word of it, all the way down to the marrow. But the council had been wrong. The cold betas had been wrong. Even the old scholars who had written long ago of her kind, scratching their certain words onto their certain pages, They had been wrong, too, every last one of them. For they had looked upon the gentleness of the Omega and never once thought to ask the only question that mattered. They had never asked what the gentleness was made of. They thought Omegas were soothers because they were weak. The truth was the very opposite of that. The truth was so much more terrible than any of them had ever dared to dream. An Omega could soothe the bloodlust of the fiercest Alpha alive because she carried within her own soft body the raw, unfiltered, empathic power of every living thing that breathed. The grief and the love and the rage and the aching tenderness of the whole wide world, all of it gathered and held in one gentle frame. They calmed the storm in others, because they themselves were the storm. They had simply never once been pushed all the way to the breaking place, the place where the storm tears loose. Rowan herself had never known it was in her. She had spent her entire life keeping something folded down small, and not once had she dreamed how vast the thing was that she had been folding. She had poured it out slowly, carefully, in lullabies and stitched wounds and quiet words spoken in the dark, one careful drop at a time, so that it would never, ever frighten the people she loved. She did not fold it down small now. She rose. The furs slid from her shoulders and fell into the snow. The thin linen dress whipped about her freezing legs in the dying wind. Barefoot, fevered, unarmed, entirely and only human, she stepped out from in front of her children, and she walked forward, and she stood alone before the great scarred Alpha and his ring of starving killers. Crane turned away from the fallen boys to face her, and something in the way she stood, something in the pale white light that had begun to gather and burn behind her eyes, made even that mad and ravenous creature pause. He should not have paused. He should have turned and run while the running was still good. The rogue leader gathered the great muscles of his haunches beneath him, and he lunged for her bare throat, his jaws gaping wide. Rowan did not flinch. She did not step back. She did not throw up her hands to shield her face. She did not close her eyes against the death rushing toward her across the snow. She reached down instead, down past the fear, down past the burning of the fever, down past every single year she had spent being told, gently and not so gently, to make herself smaller, down to the deepest, oldest, most primal well of her spirit, the one she had kept sealed and silent her whole life long, because she had been taught from her first breath that to open it was to be too much, too loud, too frightening, too far from what a soft thing ought to be. And she let it open. She unleashed a sound. It was not a scream. It was not a roar. It was something the deep woods had not heard in the lifetimes of every wolf standing in that clearing. It was a wave. A vast, concussive, soundless wave of pure empathic force. A frequency felt deep in the bones rather than heard in the ear. A rising tide of dominant, overwhelming feeling so total and so immense that it rolled outward from her in every direction at once, and struck every living thing in that clearing in the very same instant. It struck Crane in the middle of his lunge. The great rogue collapsed in the air as though he had hurled himself headlong into a wall of solid stone. He crashed down into the snow and convulsed there, his brute mind overwhelmed, drowning all at once beneath a flood of feeling too immense for any creature to hold and survive. Every grief he had ever caused, every terror he had ever inflicted on a weaker thing in the dark, every dying cry of every creature he had ever torn apart. All of it rushing into him at once, an entire black ocean of empathy crashing down without warning onto a soul that had spent its whole long, brutal life feeling nothing at all. He screamed, and he went down, and he stayed down. The wave rolled on past him. It struck the rogue that had pinned Wyatt to the snow, and the killer reeled back and off the boy, whimpering high in its throat, dropping flat with its tail tucked hard between its legs, its great body shaking like a beaten thing. It rolled on and struck the closing ring of yellow-eyed hunters, and one by one, and then all together, they collapsed, pressing themselves down into the snow, crying out in a pure and bewildered psychological agony as every cruel and hungry and merciless thing inside them was laid suddenly bare and drowned beneath the sheer, crushing weight of her power. In the space of a single drawn breath, the whole pack of killers lay flat and trembling across the snow, brought down, not by tooth, not by claw, not by any strength that the deep woods had ever had a name for, brought down by the soul of one soft woman that every creature in that clearing had taken, until this very moment, for nothing but prey. Rowan stood over them, her chest heaving, her bare feet planted firm in the bloodied snow, and her eyes blazed a brilliant, ethereal, impossible white. She looked down at the scarred Alpha, shuddering and broken at her feet. This thing that had thrown her child against a tree. This thing that had been a heartbeat away from tearing her whole family apart in the snow. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. It did not need to be loud. It carried the weight of the entire world within it. "You will not touch my sons." Crane pressed himself flatter into the snow, whining, broken, every last drop of the killer wrung out of him and replaced with a terror that he had no name for and would carry for whatever was left of his days. And it was in that exact moment that the trees at the far edge of the clearing exploded inward. A massive shape tore through the tree line in a great spray of snow and splintered branches. Vast, silver-furred, crimson-eyed, Garrett, fully shifted into his enormous alpha form, came crashing into the clearing at the head of a dozen of his finest warriors. He had followed the thin and distant sound of his children's screams through all the miles of frozen woods, expecting with every thundering stride to find the torn and frozen bodies of everything he had ever loved scattered across the snow. He had come ready to die, avenging them. He skidded to a halt, and what lay before him stopped the breath dead in his enormous chest. He found 4 rogue killers, hardened murderers of the deep woods, the terror of every exile who had ever been cast into that white, and every one of them lay flat and shuddering and utterly broken in the snow. He found his 3 sons, battered, bloodied, but up. Cole was dragging himself upright on unsteady legs at the foot of a great pine. Alive, blood at his temple, but his eyes open and burning. Wyatt was staggering free of the killer that had pinned him, snarling, whole. And Finn, small and shaking and tear-streaked, but standing, alive. All 3 of his sons, alive, and standing over the whole shattered wreckage of it, barefoot in the snow, in nothing but a torn and blood-stained linen dress, her dark hair wild around a face lit from somewhere deep within by a brilliant and unearthly white, stood the woman he had cast out to die. The soft little Omega. The weakness he had believed he was cutting cleanly out of his pack. She had brought 4 hardened killers to their knees with nothing at all in her empty hands. Nothing but the very thing he had thrown into the snow. Nothing but the soul he had been far too proud and far too blind to ever truly see. Garrett shifted back into his human form, and his legs very nearly gave way beneath him as he did, and he stood there in the cold and the gold of the breaking dawn, and he could not find a single word. Everything he had ever believed about her, about strength and weakness, about who was the soft one and who was the powerful one across all the long years they had shared a bed and a bond and a life. All of it lay shattered now in the snow at her bare feet, scattered there among the broken bodies of the rogues. The white light began slowly to ebb from Rowan's eyes. The vast and ancient power she had unleashed drained back down into the deep well it had risen from, and as it went, it carried the very last of her strength away with it. Her knees began to tremble beneath her. The fever, held off through all of it by nothing but the iron of her will, came rolling back in over her like a returning tide. She swayed where she stood in the snow, but she did not fall. She turned, away from the broken rogues at her feet, away from the great silver alpha frozen and speechless in the snow behind her, and she went to her children. She dropped to her knees in the bloodied snow beside Cole and took his battered young face in both her shaking hands, searching it, her breath catching hard on a sob she would not let herself release. Where are you hurt? Show me. Cole, look at me now, sweet boy. Show me where it hurts. I am all right, he breathed, though he was not, though there was dark blood at his temple, and his ribs caught fire when he tried to draw a full breath. I am all right, but you, Rowan, you, what was that? What was that? She did not answer him. She had no answer she could give a child, not for that. Not yet. The truth was that she did not fully understand it herself. She only pulled him in against her, and then reached and gathered Wyatt, and then little Finn, drawing all 3 of her bleeding, shaking, impossible boys into her arms there in the snow. And she held them as though the world itself would have to be torn apart before she let any of them go again. And the dawn broke fully over the clearing at last. It washed the broken world in pale gold and bruised purple light, and it fell upon a scene that would be whispered of in the deep woods for far longer than any wolf standing there would live to see. A barefoot woman kneeling in the red snow, 3 battered boys held fierce and close in her arms, 4 killers lying broken and trembling at the edge of the dark trees, and a great silver alpha, the proud and undisputed lord of all the black pine, standing apart from them all, brought lower by the thing he was seeing with his own eyes than he had ever once been brought low by any blade in any war. Garrett took a single, careful step toward them. Rowan, he breathed. His voice was thick and ragged and drowning in a relief and a grief and a shame far too vast for any one man to carry alone. The gods be praised. You are alive. The boys, they are. You are all of you. He reached out one huge scarred hand to pull Cole into his arms, to gather his sons against his chest, to touch, at long last, the family he had so very nearly destroyed with his own pride. And a low, vicious snarl stopped him cold where he stood. It did not come from any rogue. It came from Cole. The boy pulled himself out of Rowan's arms, swaying on his feet, and he turned, and he set himself squarely between his father and his mother, bloodied, half broken, 10 years old, and entirely, utterly without fear. Wyatt rose and came to stand beside him, and then little Finn, scrubbing the tears from his face, came and stood on Cole's other side. 3 small, battered figures, forming a living wall in the snow between the great Alpha and the woman kneeling behind them. And the golden eyes of his 3 heirs, the very eyes that mirrored his own gold so perfectly, looked up at Garrett now not with the love and the reverence of sons, but with the cold, hard, and level judgment of rival alphas. "You do not touch her," Cole said. His young voice rang out clear across the silent clearing with an authority that did not belong to any child, an authority that no wolf there, not the warriors, not the broken rogues, not even his own father, dared for one moment to challenge. Garrett stopped. His outstretched hand fell slowly back to his side, and the great lord of the Black Pine stood frozen in the gold and bloody light of dawn, staring at the wall his own bloodied children had built against him in the snow, beginning at last, far too late, to understand the true and terrible size of the thing that he had done, and to understand, with a dawning and bottomless dread, just how very far he would have to fall before any one of them would ever let him near their mother again. Garrett did not try to touch her again. He stood in the bloody snow, the great lord of the Black Pine, and he looked at the wall his own children had made of their small, battered bodies. And then, slowly, he did a thing no wolf in that clearing had ever thought to see. He sank to his knees. The crimson faded from his eyes, leaving them gold again, and then leaving them only the eyes of a man who had ridden out into a storm expecting to bury everything he loved, and had instead been brought face to face with the size of his own ruin. "Rowan," he said again, and his voice broke on the second syllable. "I was blind." The words came out of him in pieces, rough and uneven, the words of a man who had never once in his life had to ask forgiveness for anything. "Sloane, she poisoned my mind. The council, the letters, the scent on the paper, all of it. She built it. The letters were forged, Garrett. I know what she did." Rowan rose slowly to her feet behind her sons. The white light was gone from her eyes now. The vast power had drained away and left her looking exactly what she was. Exhausted. Fevered. A woman in a torn dress who had walked through her own death and come out the other side. But she did not look broken. She would never look broken again. "I told you this in the Great Hall," she said, and her voice was quiet and steady and utterly drained of the warmth it had once held for him. "I stood before you all, accused of a thing I never did, and I asked you for one thing. One. I asked you to look into my eyes and to find the bond we had carried together through every winter of our lives, and to trust it over a piece of paper." Garrett flinched as though she had struck him. "And you looked away." The clearing was silent. Even the broken rogues had gone still. "We can mend it," Garrett said, and now there was desperation climbing into his voice, the desperation of a man watching the ground open beneath everything he had built. He reached out toward the hem of her dress, not daring to touch it, his huge scarred hand trembling in the air. "Rowan, we can mend the bond. I will have Sloane cast out before the sun reaches its height. I will strip every council member who stood by and let it happen. I will give you anything, the throne itself. Just come back to me. Be my mate again. be my queen." Rowan looked down at him for a long moment. The man she had loved. The man whose scars she had kissed. The man whose nightmares she had gathered into her own arms more nights than she could count. And then she looked at the three boys standing between them, bloodied, fierce, hers. "No," she said softly. The single word fell into the snow with the weight of a closing door. "I am not coming back to be your mate, Garrett." His face crumpled. "Rowan, please. That bond is dead." There was no cruelty in it. There was something almost worse than cruelty. There was finality. You did not break it when you stopped loving me, because you never stopped loving me. I know that now. I felt it in the Great Hall, the way it tore at you. You broke it when you chose your pride over your own heart. When you decided that looking strong in front of your pack mattered more than being right in front of your own soul. You severed it yourself, Garrett, when you closed those gates. And a thing like that does not grow back. Garrett bowed his head, and the great Alpha wept, there on his knees in the snow, silently, his shoulders shaking. "But," Rowan said, and he looked up, through the tears, with a single, flickering, desperate flame of hope. "I will return to the Black Pine." The hope flared brighter, and then she spoke again, and her voice had changed. It was no longer the voice of a wounded mate, or a gentle healer, or a soft thing pleading to be believed. It had turned to something else entirely. Something cold and clear and edged like polished steel. The voice of a ruler. "I will return as regent, as protector of these three cubs who walked into a death storm for me when no one else in your whole great pack would so much as meet my eyes. I am their mother. I have always been their mother. And from this day on, the law of the Black Pine will recognize it." Garrett stared up at her. "You will step down from the high seat," Rowan continued. And there was no question in it, no negotiation, only the laying out of a thing already decided. "You will remain the general of the armies. Your strength has its place, and the pack will need it when the next winter brings the next war. But you will hold no power over the laws of the Black Pine, and you will hold no power over me, not ever again." The words rang out across the silent clearing. Cole will take the high seat when he comes of age. He was born to lead, and he proved it in this snow, when he put himself between his family and a killer 3 times his size without a heartbeat of fear. Until that day comes, the Black Pine answers to its Omega. For a long moment, Garrett did not move, and inside him, a war was being fought, to abdicate, to step down from the high seat, to hand the law of his own pack to the mate he had wronged, and the throne of his bloodline to a son who looked at him now like an enemy. For an alpha, for a man like Garrett, who had spent his whole life learning that the only way to survive was to be the hardest thing in the room. It was unthinkable. Everything in his blood screamed against it. But then he looked at his sons. He looked at Cole, 10 years old, bloodied, planted like a young oak between his parents, golden eyes daring his father to argue. He looked at Wyatt, fierce and watchful, at his brother's side. He looked at little Finn, small fists clenched, ready to fight a grown alpha if that was what it took. And Garrett understood the truth of his position with perfect, devastating clarity. If he refused her, if he held on to his pride one more time, The way he had held on to it in the great hall, his sons would turn and walk back into the woods with her, and they would not come back. He had already lost his mate to his pride. If he reached for it now, one final time, he would lose his children, his legacy, and his pack along with her, and he would be left to rule an empty lodge with a crown no one respected. He had been given, against all that he deserved, one single chance to choose differently than he had chosen in the hall, to choose his family over his pride. Slowly, agonizingly, the great lord of the Black Pine bowed his head. He lowered it down and down until his forehead touched the cold snow at Rowan's bare feet. "As you command," he whispered, "my queen." And the three boys, watching their father lay his pride down in the snow, finally, slowly, let the wall between them soften. The return to the Black Pine was a quiet and solemn procession. When the great gates groaned open this time, there was no feast laid out to greet them, no false celebration, no spiced wine to mask any lingering scent. There was only a pack standing silent in the cold, watching, as the truth of what had happened in the deep woods came riding home. Sloane was waiting on the high balcony. She had heard the horns. She had come out expecting to see the frozen bodies of her rivals dragged home across the snow. She had dressed for it. She had arranged her face into the perfect picture of a grief she did not feel. And instead, she saw Rowan, wrapped in Garrett's own royal furs, riding upon the Alpha's personal steed, her head held high, her three cubs flanking her like a guard of honor. And Garrett walking on foot beside the horse, his head bowed, leading his mate home like a servant, not a king. The color drained from Sloane's beautiful face. She understood in that single frozen moment exactly what it meant. The whole careful architecture of her lies, the months of patient poison, the forged letters, the stolen scent, all of it had not just failed. It had turned and come home and was riding through the gates to find her. The truth came apart quickly after that. Under questioning, Sloane's own handmaidens broke, one after another, and confessed to the forgery, the stolen seal, the scent lifted from the Omega's pillow, the whole patient construction of a good woman's ruin. But it was Hale, the old soldier, who brought the darker truth fully into the light. He had pulled his thread to its bitter end. It had led him to the blind spot in the eastern wall, and to a runner caught slipping back through it, and to a confession dragged out cold and complete. Sloane had not merely wanted the throne. She had been the lover of the rogue king, Crane, far longer than anyone had dreamed. She had been feeding him the Black Pine secrets, its patrol routes, and its weak places, long before she ever forged a single letter in Rowan's name. The framing of the Omega had only been one move in a far larger and darker game. Her true plan had been to remove Rowan, to take her place at Garrett's side, and then, when the trust was won and the guard was down, to open the gates one night and let the wastelands pour in. The boys she had watched grow up, the pack that had sheltered her, all of it she would have handed to the killers in the dark. When the full truth was laid bare before the great hall, there was no trial that needed arguing. There was only the question of the sentence. And the Black Pine answered it the way the Black Pine answered such things. Sloane was stripped of her noble garments, exactly as she had once arranged for Rowan to be stripped of hers. She was led to the heavy oak doors at the height of the sun, and she was cast out into the deep woods. But there was a difference. When Rowan had walked out through those gates, 3 small faces had pressed against the glass of the nursery tower, and 3 small hands had risen to tap 3 small chests. When Rowan had walked into the white, love had followed her into it. No one followed Sloane. No cub crept out through the old tunnels into the night to keep her warm. No quiet wolf mourned her at the edge of any feast. The handmaidens she had commanded would not meet her eyes. The pack she had nearly sold turned its back on her as one. The heavy gates slammed shut behind her, and the endless freezing white swallowed her whole, and her name, and every lie she had ever told. And so Rowan came at last into the great hall. She did not climb to the secondary chair beside the high seat, the lower chair that mates were always given, the one set a little beneath the alpha's own. She walked past it without a glance, and she took the high seat itself. She climbed the steps before the whole silent pack, and she turned, and she sat down upon the throne of the black pine, wrapped in royal furs, her 3 cubs arrayed on the steps below her. And she looked out over the faces of every wolf who had once stared at the floor while she was condemned. In the era of the small and silent Omega, the soft thing to be used and overlooked and thrown away, was dragged out into the light at last and quietly, permanently dismantled. She did not rule with fear. She had every right to. The pack had wronged her in the worst way a pack can wrong one of its own, and there was not a soul beneath that roof who would have raised a voice against her if she had chosen to rule with a hard and bitter hand. But that was not what she had learned out in the snow. What she had learned out in the snow was that the greatest strength in all the world is not the loudest roar, or the sharpest claw, or the highest seat. It is the thing that walks into a death storm for someone, simply because they are yours. It is the heart that refuses to leave. So she ruled the way she had always lived, with empathy, with mercy where mercy was earned, with a justice that was clear and fair and unflinching when justice was needed. But never again with her own light dimmed down small to make others comfortable. The warriors whose wounds she had sown, the young mothers whose births she had walked through, the lower wolves who had felt the warmth go out of the world the day the gates closed behind her. They came to her, one by one, in the weeks that followed, to ask her forgiveness for their silence, for looking at the floor, for letting her be damned without a word. And Rowan, from the high seat, gave it, not because they had earned it, some of them had not, but because she had finally learned the difference between being soft and being kind. Softness had been the cage they kept her in. Kindness was a thing she chose freely from a place of power, because she would rather build a pack worth leading than rule over one that only feared her. She never taught these lessons with speeches. She taught them the way she had always taught everything. On the floor by the fire, a needle in her hand, a frightened young wolf going quiet under her touch, and 3 boys, growing taller every season, watching how their mother could hold an entire room without once raising her voice. They learned it without ever knowing they were being taught, the way the truest things are always learned. Garrett kept his word. He stepped down from the high seat, and he took up his place as general of the armies, and he served the pack in war as well as he had ever served it. He never reached for the bond again. He never asked Rowan to be his mate again. He had learned, too late, the price of his pride, and he carried that knowledge like a stone in his chest for the rest of his days, and it made him, in the end, a humbler and a better man than the proud lord who had cast his mate into the snow. Sometimes, in the evenings, he would watch Rowan from across the great hall, the way he had on that last quiet night before everything broke. Watch her, with their 3 sons gathered close around her in the firelight, and the ache in his chest, the ghost of a bond he had killed with his own hands, would rise. But he never spoke of it. He had lost the right. Rowan raised Cole and Wyatt and Finn into the 3 most formidable alphas the territory had ever known. Strong, yes. All 3 of them grew vast and powerful, as their blood had promised. But it was not their strength that the deep woods came to fear, and the neighboring packs came to respect. It was the thing their mother had pressed into them on 100 firelit nights, and in one freezing storm, that none of them ever forgot. And they never forgot it, not for the rest of their long lives, not when they grew taller than their father, not when Cole at last took the high seat as a grown alpha and ruled the Black Pine in his own right. They never forgot the night they walked out into the dark, the night 3 small boys looked at everything they had ever known and waited against one soft woman freezing alone in the snow, and chose her. The night they proved, once and for all, the thing their mother had spent her whole gentle life trying to teach a pack that would not listen, that the soul of a people is not its strongest warrior. It is the one who loves them enough to stay. And in the great lodge of the Black Pine, on the high seat she had walked through her own death to claim, a woman who had once been cast out as worthless ruled long and wisely and well, surrounded always by the 3 brave hearts who had refused, when it mattered most, to let her go. She had walked out of those gates with her head bowed, believing she had lost everything. She had walked back in with her head high and taken back everything that was hers. And she never bowed her head again.